The relentless summer heat beat down upon the rugged terrain of eastern Nevada as Blake Daniels spotted the crumpled figure at the edge of his property. A woman's body motionless against the unforgiving desert landscape. Her clothes tattered and stained with the red dust that seemed to claim everything in this territory. The year was 1873, and survival in the shadow of the Ruby Mountains required a hardiness few possessed, especially those foolish enough to travel alone. Blake slowed his horse, squinting against the sun's glare as he approached with caution, one hand hovering instinctively over the Colt revolver at his hip. Outlaws had been known to use all manner of tricks to lure unsuspecting ranchers into ambushes, and 5 years in this territory had taught him vigilance. Yet as he drew closer, even from horseback he could see the woman's sunken cheeks and the desperate way her body curled in on itself, not the posture of someone planning an attack, but of someone who had surrendered to fate. "Madam." His voice carried across the distance between them, rough from disuse. When she didn't stir, Blake dismounted, his boots raising small clouds of dust as he approached. Kneeling beside her, he noted her pulse weak but present, and the way her cracked lips moved wordlessly, seeking moisture that wasn't there. She couldn't have been much older than 25, with hair that might have been golden when not dulled by dirt and privation. Her hands, though filthy, showed no calluses of farm work, and her clothing, despite its current state, had once been of quality material. This was no local woman. She'd come from somewhere else, perhaps far away. Blake considered his options. The nearest town, Elko, was a full day's ride, and the woman wouldn't survive that journey in her condition. His ranch was only an hour back, modest but sufficient, with enough supplies to help someone in need. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe," he said, though he doubted she could hear him. With practiced movements, he lifted her surprisingly light body onto his horse before mounting behind her, one arm securing her against his chest as they began the ride home. Her breathing was shallow against him, and he found himself urging his horse to a faster pace than prudence typically allowed in the midday heat. The woman didn't stir once during their journey, not even when they crossed the small stream that marked the eastern boundary of his property, or when they finally approached the simple 2-room cabin he'd built with his own hands after purchasing the land 3 years prior. Inside, Blake laid her on his bed, the only proper one in the house, and set about gathering what she'd need: water first and foremost. He dampened a cloth and carefully wiped the dust from her face, revealing features that confirmed his earlier assessment. This was no frontier woman. Her skin, though now parched and reddened by exposure, had the particular quality that spoke of a life spent largely indoors, protected from the elements that shaped the faces of those who worked the land. As he tipped a few drops of water between her lips, her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes of a startling blue-green that reminded him of the mountain lakes he'd seen in his travels north. For a moment she seemed to focus on him, confusion and fear crossing her features before exhaustion reclaimed her. "You're safe," Blake said, though he wasn't sure she'd heard him. "Rest now." While she slept, Blake prepared a thin broth from his modest stores, adding extra water to make it easier to swallow. He had questions, many of them, but they would have to wait. First, he needed to keep this stranger alive. Night fell across the land, bringing with it the profound silence that had initially disturbed Blake when he'd first moved west from Pennsylvania. Now, he found comfort in it as he kept watch over his unexpected guest, periodically checking her breathing and offering small sips of water whenever she stirred. It was near midnight when she finally awoke properly, her eyes opening with a start as she attempted to sit up, only to fall back against the pillow with a groan. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely audible, rough from thirst despite his efforts. "My ranch," Blake replied, moving to her side with a cup of water. "About 20 miles east of Elko. Found you collapsed at the edge of my property." He helped her drink, supporting her head with a gentleness that felt foreign to his calloused hands. She managed several swallows before exhaustion forced her back down. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes searching his face. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You nearly did," Blake said simply. "What's your name?" "Lillian," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Lillian Crawford." "Blake Daniels," he offered in return. "What brings a woman like you out here alone, Miss Crawford?" Her eyes clouded with something fear, perhaps, or painful memory before she turned her face away. "I was traveling to California. My transportation arrangements fell through." Blake knew evasion when he heard it, but now wasn't the time to press. "Rest," he said instead. "We'll talk more when you're stronger." Over the next 3 days, Blake maintained a careful routine. Each morning, he completed his essential ranch work before noon, then spent the remainder of the day tending to Lillian. He began with broth, then graduated to soft foods as her strength slowly returned: boiled oats, mashed beans, stewed apples from his small orchard. On the 4th day, Lillian was able to sit up unassisted, though standing remained beyond her capacity. Her body, Blake realized, had been starved for longer than just the days she'd spent wandering lost. There was a hollowness to her cheeks and a fragility to her wrists that spoke of prolonged hunger. "I should be able to travel soon," she said as Blake brought her a bowl of stew for the evening meal. "I don't want to impose further." "Travel where?" Blake asked, settling into the chair he'd placed beside the bed. "You said California, but that's a big place, and you're still weeks of hard travel from even its eastern border." Lillian stared into her bowl, stirring the contents without eating. "I have family in Sacramento." "At least I believe I do." "You believe?" she sighed, finally meeting his gaze. "My mother's sister moved there years ago. I've never met her, but I have an address. It's the only place I have left to go." Blake nodded, not pushing further. Whatever had driven this woman to attempt crossing Nevada alone in summer without proper provisions was her business. If she wanted to share more, she would. "Well, you won't be traveling anywhere for at least a few weeks," he said pragmatically. "Not until you've got some strength back." To his surprise, tears welled in her eyes. "I can't repay you. I have nothing." "I'm not asking for payment," Blake said, uncomfortable with her emotion. "Just don't die on my property. Would create a lot of paperwork I'd rather avoid." The weak joke earned a small smile, which transformed her face in a way that made Blake look away, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their arrangement. He was a 32-year-old bachelor living alone, now housing an unmarried woman under his roof. If they'd been in town rather than 20 miles from civilization, tongues would already be wagging. "I can sleep in the other room once you're able to care for yourself," he said, rising from the chair. "For now, I'll continue on the floor." Lillian nodded, her eyes downcast again. "Mr. Daniels, may I ask, is there a town nearby where I might find work? Once I'm recovered, I mean." Blake considered this. "Elko's growing since the railroad came through. Might be something there, though I don't go to town often enough to know what's available." "I can cook," she offered. "And so? I was trained as a governess, but I don't imagine there's much call for that here." "Not much," Blake agreed. "Most families around here consider themselves fortunate if their children learn basic reading between spring planting and fall harvest." Silence fell between them, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. Blake moved to the window, gazing out at the darkness, acutely aware of how his solitary existence had been disrupted. Yet somehow, the disruption felt less intrusive than he might have expected. Why did you help me?" Lillian asked suddenly. Blake turned, finding her watching him with an intensity that suggested the question meant more to her than simple curiosity. "Would have been harder not to," he replied honestly. "Man finds someone dying on his land. He's got two choices: help or walk away. Walking away sits poorly. Many would have walked away," she said softly, "especially from a stranger." Blake shrugged, uncomfortable with the implied praise. "Get some rest, Miss Crawford. We'll figure out your next steps when you're stronger." As the days passed, Lillian's strength gradually returned. By the end of the second week, she was able to move around the cabin, though extended periods of activity still left her exhausted. She insisted on helping with small chores, washing dishes, mending Blake's shirts with neat, precise stitches that made his own clumsy repairs look like a child's work. They settled into an unexpected rhythm. Blake would rise before dawn, tending to the livestock and checking the irrigation ditches that kept his modest crops alive in the arid climate. Lillian would have coffee ready by the time he returned, and sometimes biscuits made from the limited stores in his pantry. Their conversations remained cautious, circling around safe topics: the weather, the progress of his corn, stories about the local wildlife. Blake found himself speaking more in those 2 weeks than he had in the previous 6 months combined, his natural reticence gradually yielding to Lillian's gentle questions. It was during the 3rd week that Blake returned from his morning chores to find Lillian pale and trembling, seated at his small table with a sheet of paper clutched in her hand. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting down his hat and crossing to her side. "I found this," she said, holding up a year-old newspaper he'd kept for some reason he couldn't recall. "It has news from St. Louis." Blake frowned, not understanding her distress. "I get papers when I go to town, save some for starting fires." "There's an article," Lillian continued, her voice tight with emotion, "about a man named Howard Crawford." The name meant nothing to Blake, but clearly it held significance for her. "Relation of yours, my husband," she whispered, and the word landed between them with the weight of a stone. Blake felt something shift in his perception of her, not just the revelation that she was married, but the way her face had transformed with fear at the mention of the man's name. "Former husband," Lillian corrected herself, still staring at the paper. "He's looking for me. This article mentions that he's offering a reward for information." Blake carefully pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. "You're running from him." It wasn't a question, and Lillian didn't treat it as one. Instead, she set the paper down and pushed up the sleeve of her borrowed shirt, one of Blake's old ones, much too large for her frame, revealing a pattern of faded yellowish bruises and the distinctive marks of healed burns. "He did this?" Blake asked, his voice tight. Lillian nodded, pulling the sleeve back down. "And worse. I fled St. Louis 6 months ago with nothing but what I could carry. I've been making my way west ever since, taking odd jobs when I could find them. And starving when you couldn't," Blake finished for her. "Yes," she admitted. "The last town I passed through. There was a man who said he'd give me a meal in exchange for work, but his intentions became clear quickly enough, and I left without eating. I thought I could make it to Elko before." She trailed off, the outcome of that miscalculation being evident. Blake sat back, processing this information. A married woman, technically still someone else's wife in the eyes of the law, regardless of her reasons for fleeing. It complicated matters, though it explained her caution and her reluctance to share details of her past. "He won't stop looking," Lillian said quietly. "He's a prominent businessman with connections throughout the Midwest. His pride won't allow him to accept that I've left." "Nevada's a long way from St. Louis," Blake pointed out. "Not far enough if someone recognizes my name and writes to him," she countered. The newspaper is from last year, but he's persistent. Blake considered this, then made a decision that surprised even himself. Then perhaps you should use a different name. Lillian looked up, hope and wariness warring in her expression. What do you mean? I mean, Blake said carefully, that Elko's growing. Nobody there knows much about me except that I keep to myself and pay for goods in cash. If I were to introduce you as, say, a widowed sister come to live with me after hardship back east, nobody would question it. You do that, Lillian's voice caught. Why? Blake wasn't entirely certain of the answer himself. All he knew was that the thought of this woman returning to a man who would burn and bruise her made something cold and hard form in his chest. Like I said before, sometimes helping is easier than walking away, he replied. Besides, I could use the help around here. Place could benefit from a woman's touch, and I've never been much of a cook. It wasn't the full truth. Blake had managed alone for years and could continue doing so, but it offered Lillian dignity by suggesting an exchange of services rather than charity. I'll earn my keep, she promised, her fingers finally releasing their death grip on the newspaper. And I won't bring trouble to your door. Blake nodded, hoping that was a promise she could keep, though suspecting that trouble had a way of finding those who fled from it. We'll need to go to town soon for supplies. You can be Lillian Davis, my widowed sister from back east. Davis, she repeated, testing the name. Yes, I think I can remember that. Their first trip to Elko came a week later when Blake judged Lillian strong enough for the journey. He lent her his only spare shirt and a pair of trousers that had to be heavily modified with hasty stitching to stay on her smaller frame, topped with a coat that swallowed her despite the summer heat. It wasn't ideal, but it would do until they could purchase proper women's clothing. The small frontier town buzzed with the activity that the railroad had brought new buildings under construction, freight wagons loaded with goods, and the usual mix of settlers, miners, and cowboys that populated this part of Nevada. Blake felt Lillian tense beside him as they rode into town, her hands gripping the saddle horn until her knuckles whitened. Nobody's looking at you, he assured her quietly. Just another dusty traveler. The general store, operated by a perpetually suspicious man named Jenkins, was their first stop. Blake helped Lillian down from the horse and offered his arm as they entered, conscious of maintaining the facade of brother and sister. Daniels, Jenkins acknowledged with a nod. Been a while. Who's this? My sister, Blake replied with the practiced ease of someone used to giving only the information necessary. Lillian. Her husband passed last winter back in Pennsylvania. She's come to live with me. Jenkins gave Lillian a once-over, noting her ill-fitting clothes and too thin frame but apparently finding nothing suspicious enough to comment on. Madam, he greeted with a tip of his head. Sorry for your loss. Thank you, Lillian replied softly, her eyes downcast in a convincing display of lingering grief. They purchased the essentials: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, and ammunition before Blake indicated the small selection of ready-made women's clothing at the back of the store. Get what you need, he told Lillian, within reason. While Lillian selected a modest assortment of practical garments, Blake arranged for the delivery of a larger order to his ranch, including lumber and roofing materials. The look Jenkins gave him spoke volumes. Planning on expanding, Daniels? The shopkeeper asked with poorly concealed interest. Thought that one-room cabin suited you fine. 2 rooms, Blake corrected, and a lady needs her privacy. Jenkins nodded sagely. Course. Just surprising to hear you had family, never mentioned them before. Never came up, Blake replied tersely, counting out money for their purchases. They completed their business efficiently, with Lillian changing into one of her new dresses in a back room before they departed. The transformation was striking. Even the simple calico, properly fitted to her form, restored a measure of dignity that the borrowed men's clothing had stripped away. As they left the general store, Blake noted with concern the way several men's gazes followed Lillian. A woman, especially one with Lillian's fine features, now more visible with her hair properly arranged under a modest bonnet, was still a relatively rare sight in Elko. He guided her quickly toward the small restaurant where he'd promised her a proper meal before their return journey. "People are staring," Lillian whispered as they walked. "Women are scarce out here," Blake explained. "Most men haven't seen one as refined as you in some time." The restaurant was little more than a large room with mismatched tables and a kitchen that produced basic but filling meals. As they ate, Lillian gradually relaxed, even smiling at the proprietress who brought them extra bread after noting Lillian's obvious appreciation of the simple food. "When did you last eat in a proper establishment?" Blake asked, observing the careful way she savored each bite. "Not since St. Louis," she admitted. "The journey west has been challenging." Blake nodded, not pressing for details she clearly preferred to avoid. "The lumber will be delivered next week. I'll build an addition to the cabin. Give you your own room." Surprise flickered across her face. "You're building an addition," I thought. "I assumed the arrangement was temporary." "Winter's coming in a few months," Blake said practically. "Travel to California would be difficult, if not impossible, once the mountain passes snow over. Makes sense for you to stay at least until spring." The real reason went unspoken that Blake was increasingly certain that Lillian Crawford, or Davis as she was now known, had nowhere else to go. Her story about an aunt in Sacramento might be true, but the hesitation in her voice when she spoke of it suggested otherwise. "Thank you," Lillian said softly, meeting his gaze with genuine gratitude. "I promise I won't be a burden." Blake nodded, uncomfortable with her thanks. "Ranch needs tending. An extra pair of hands makes the work lighter." Their return journey was undertaken in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The landscape stretched out around them, harsh yet beautiful in the late afternoon light, the Ruby Mountains visible in the distance. For Blake, the presence of another person riding beside him was still a novelty. He'd chosen solitude deliberately after the war, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of ranch life and the absence of expectations beyond those he placed on himself. Yet Lillian's presence hadn't disrupted that peace as he might have feared. The following weeks established a new pattern to their lives. Blake worked on building the addition to the cabin, a simple room adjoining the main structure, while Lillian took over the domestic aspects of ranch life with quiet efficiency. She transformed his Spartan existence with small touches: curtains fashioned from feed sacks, wildflowers in a jar on the table, meals that made use of his garden's produce in ways he'd never considered. By the time autumn painted the few deciduous trees on the property in shades of gold and crimson, the new room was complete, modestly furnished with a bed frame Blake had constructed and a small chest of drawers purchased from town. Lillian moved her few possessions into the space, arranging them with the care of someone who had learned to treasure what little she had. "It's perfect," she told Blake on the first evening after the room was finished, genuine pleasure lighting her features. "I never thought I'd have a space of my own again." Blake, unused to praise, merely nodded. "It'll keep the cold out once winter comes." As the days grew shorter and the nights cooler, they fell into a comfortable routine. Blake taught Lillian the basics of ranch work: how to milk the 2 cows, tend the chickens, and harvest the last of the garden before frost claimed it. In return, Lillian showed Blake how to preserve food for winter, canning vegetables and drying herbs with a skill born of proper training. It was during one such evening, as they worked together to process the apple harvest from the small orchard behind the cabin, that Blake first noticed how Lillian had changed since her arrival. The hollow-cheeked, desperate woman he'd found collapsed on his property had been replaced by someone with strength in her movements and color in her cheeks. Her hands, once soft despite their dirt, had developed the beginning of calluses that marked honest work. "You're staring, Mr. Daniels," Lillian remarked without looking up from the apple she was peeling, her tone light. Blake cleared his throat, embarrassed at being caught. "Just noticing you're handling the knife better. Less likely to take off a finger now." Lillian laughed, a sound that had become more frequent as autumn progressed. "High praise indeed. Perhaps next you'll compliment my chicken feeding technique." "Chickens are still alive, aren't they?" Blake returned with unusual humor. "Must be doing something right." These moments of easy conversation had become more common, though both still maintained certain boundaries. Blake never asked about Howard Crawford or the specifics of what had driven Lillian to flee, and Lillian never questioned Blake about the war or why a man in his prime had chosen isolation over town life. Winter arrived with the first heavy snowfall in late November, transforming the landscape and effectively isolating the ranch from Elko, except in cases of dire necessity. Blake had prepared well, with ample stores of food, firewood, and other essentials to see them through until spring. The confinement might have tested their arrangement had they not already established a rhythm that accommodated both Blake's need for solitude and Lillian's growing confidence in her place on the ranch. While storms raged outside, they found ways to coexist in the small space. Blake, repairing harnesses and tools by the fire while Lillian sewed or read from one of the few books he possessed. It was during one such evening, with wind howling around the cabin's sturdy walls, that Lillian finally spoke of her past unprompted. "I was 19 when I married Howard," she said quietly, her hand stilling on the shirt she was mending. "My father arranged it." Howard was 43, a widower with business connections my father valued. Blake set down the bridle he'd been oiling, giving her his full attention, though he maintained an outward appearance of casual interest. This was the most she'd ever shared at once, and he sensed it was important not to interrupt. He was considerate at first, not kind exactly, but not cruel either, more like a man who had acquired an object he'd been told had value. Lillian's voice remained steady, though her fingers tightened around the fabric in her lap. "It changed after my father died less than a year later. Howard no longer had reason to maintain appearances." Blake nodded, understanding the implications without requiring details. "And no one stepped in." "No one could," Lillian said simply. "In the eyes of society, I was his wife, his property essentially. My mother had passed years before, and I had no brothers to intervene. Howard was respected in St. Louis, a businessman, a philanthropist." Her mouth twisted on the last word. "When I finally fled, I took nothing but a few personal items and what money I had managed to save in secret." "Brave," Blake commented, the word inadequate for the courage such an action would have required. Lillian shook her head. "Desperate. There's a difference." She finally looked up from her mending, meeting Blake's gaze directly. "I tell you this because I want you to understand why I can't return east, ever, and why I'm so grateful for what you've done." "You've earned your place here," Blake said gruffly, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Work hard, contribute your share. That's all anyone can ask." Lillian smiled, recognizing the sentiment behind his practical words. "Nevertheless, I want you to know that I understand the risk you've taken. Harboring another man's wife could have consequences." "Let Crawford come looking in Nevada if he dares," Blake replied, a hint of steel entering his voice. He'd find the reception less welcoming than in St. Louis. The simple declaration of protection seemed to ease something in Lillian's posture. She returned to her mending, but the silence between them had shifted subtly, no longer protective, but comfortable, built on a foundation of shared understanding. Christmas came and went with little ceremony beyond a special meal, and an exchange of modest gifts, a knitted scarf from Lillian, a carved wooden box Blake had worked on in secret for weeks. New Year followed, marking not just the beginning of 1874 but also 6 months since Lillian had arrived at the ranch. Winter maintained its grip on the land well into March, isolating them further but providing time for planning the spring planting. Lillian proved to have a good mind for organization, helping Blake expand his garden plans and suggesting crop rotations that would improve yield. "How does a St. Louis governess know so much about farming?" Blake asked one evening as they reviewed his seed inventory. "My grandparents had a farm in Pennsylvania," Lillian explained. "I spent summers there as a child. My grandmother believed all education should be practical as well as academic." Blake nodded appreciatively. "Wise woman." "She would have liked you," Lillian said with a small smile. She had little patience for pretense or wasted words. The comment, simple as it was, created a moment of connection that lingered between them as they continued their work. Blake found himself wondering what it might have been like to know Lillian before Crawford, before the war that had changed his own perspective so dramatically, before the circumstances that had brought them together. Spring's arrival transformed the land, melting the snow to reveal tender green growth beneath. The workload increased exponentially, with fields to prepare, seeds to plant, and livestock requiring attention as new animals were born. Blake and Lillian worked side by side from dawn until dusk most days, falling into bed exhausted but satisfied with their progress. It was during this busy season that Blake first noticed a change in how he perceived Lillian. The woman who had arrived as a responsibility, a moral obligation he couldn't ignore, had become something else entirely, a partner in the truest sense, someone whose presence he not only accepted but valued. The realization came to him one afternoon as he watched her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with her hair escaping its practical braid, completely absorbed in setting delicate seedlings into the ground. There was a rightness to her presence there that disturbed him with its intensity, as if she belonged on his land in a way that transcended their arrangement. Blake turned away, troubled by the direction of his thoughts. Lillian Crawford remained a married woman, regardless of the circumstances that had driven her from her husband. To harbor feelings beyond friendship or practical partnership was not only inappropriate but potentially dangerous for them both. Yet the awareness, once acknowledged, proved impossible to dismiss. Blake found himself noticing details he'd previously overlooked: the graceful movement of Lillian's hands as she worked, the way sunlight caught in her hair, now restored to its natural golden hue, the sound of her humming as she went about her tasks. If Lillian noticed his occasional discomfort or increased tendency to seek solitude when work allowed, she gave no indication. Instead, she continued to fulfill her role on the ranch with the same quiet competence that had characterized her presence since she'd regained her strength. It was in late April, when the land had fully awakened from winter's grip, that their carefully maintained balance was disrupted by an unexpected visitor. Blake was repairing a section of fence on the eastern edge of his property when he heard the approach of horses, more than one, moving at a deliberate pace along the road that connected his ranch to Elko. Visitors were rare enough to warrant caution, and Blake positioned himself with a clear view of the approaching riders while remaining partially concealed behind a stand of juniper. 3 men came into view, their clothing and manner marking them as neither local ranchers nor passing travelers. They rode with the confident posture of men accustomed to authority, their horses well-bred and properly outfitted. The man in the lead, distinguished by his more formal attire despite the dust of travel, surveyed the landscape with the calculating gaze of someone assessing property values. Blake recognized the type immediately: men from the East, probably representing mining or railroad interests, looking to acquire land. He'd turned down similar visitors before, making it clear that his ranch wasn't for sale at any price. With a sigh, he stepped out from behind the junipers, prepared to deliver the same message again. "Afternoon," he called, keeping his tone neutral as he approached the fence line. Looking for something, the lead rider reined in his horse, studying Blake with open curiosity. "Perhaps." "Are you the owner of this property?" "I am," Blake confirmed, noting the way the other two men positioned their horses slightly behind their leader, hands resting casually near their weapons. "Blake Daniels, and you are?" "Martin Wells, representing Western Union Mining Consortium," the man replied with practiced smoothness. "We're surveying properties in the region for potential development." Blake's expression remained impassive. "Nothing to develop here but cattle and crops, Mr. Wells, and neither is for sale." Wells smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Mr. Daniels, you misunderstand. We're offering substantial compensation for mineral rights, not purchasing land outright. Your operations could continue undisturbed while we conduct exploratory mining." "No mining on my property," Blake stated flatly. Undisturbed or otherwise. The friendly facade Wells had adopted slipped slightly, revealing the harder businessman beneath. "Perhaps you should consider the offer before dismissing it. The consortium is prepared to be quite generous." "Not interested," Blake repeated, his tone making it clear that further discussion would be fruitless. Wells studied him for a moment longer, then nodded with apparent acceptance. "Very well. Though I should mention that our geologists are quite certain about the potential value beneath this region. Your neighbors might be more receptive." "That's their business," Blake replied. "Now, if there's nothing else, I have work to finish." Wells tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Of course. Good day, Mr. Daniels." He turned his horse but then paused. "One more thing, we've heard there might be a woman staying at your ranch, a relative, I believe." The seemingly casual question raised Blake's guard immediately. "My sister," he confirmed cautiously. "Why do you ask?" "Merely curious," Wells replied. "It's unusual to find unmarried women in these parts. The men in town mentioned her." Blake said nothing, unwilling to provide more information but increasingly uneasy about the direction of the conversation. "Well, please pass along our regards to the lady," Wells concluded when it became clear Blake wouldn't elaborate. "We'll be in the region for some time, should you reconsider our offer." The three men rode away, leaving Blake with a sense of foreboding that had nothing to do with mining rights. He quickly finished securing the fence section, then returned to the ranch at a faster pace than usual, concern growing with each passing minute. Lillian was hanging laundry behind the cabin when he arrived, her expression brightening at the sight of him until she registered his troubled countenance. "What's wrong?" she asked. Immediately alert, Blake dismounted, leading his horse to the small barn as Lillian followed. "Had visitors. Men from some mining consortium, or so they claimed." "You don't believe them?" Lillian asked, helping him unsaddle the horse with the practiced movements she'd learned over the past months. "I believe they're looking for minerals," Blake replied, "but they asked about you specifically." "Knew there was a woman here." Lillian's hand stilled on the saddle blanket. "What exactly did they ask?" "Wanted to know if the rumors about my sister were true," Blake said, watching her closely. Seemed more interested in that than in my refusal to sell mining rights. The color drained from Lillian's face. Did they give a name? The company they represented, Western Union Mining Consortium. Leader called himself Martin Wells. Lillian shook her head. I don't recognize the name, but that means nothing. Howard has business connections throughout the country. She gripped the edge of the stall, her knuckles whitening. If he's found me. We don't know that, Blake said firmly. Could be innocent curiosity. Women are scarce enough out here to warrant mention. But Lillian was already moving toward the cabin, her earlier calm replaced by the same desperate energy that had characterized her during their first meeting in Elko. I should leave. Tonight. If they return, you're not going anywhere, Blake interrupted, following her inside. Running now would only confirm any suspicions they might have. You don't understand, Lillian insisted, gathering her few possessions with shaking hands. Howard won't just take me back, he'll punish anyone who helped me. You've done too much already. Blake crossed the room and gently but firmly took hold of her shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. Lillian, stop. Think. Where would you go? How would you survive? The questions penetrated her panic, and her shoulders slumped beneath his hands. I don't know, she admitted. But I can't bear the thought of bringing his vengeance down on you. Let me worry about that, Blake said, his voice steady. We don't know for certain these men have any connection to Crawford. Even if they do, they saw nothing today but a rancher protecting his property rights. Nothing suspicious about that. Lillian searched his face, finding enough reassurance there to quiet her immediate fear. What do? We continue as before, Blake replied, releasing her shoulders. I'll go to town tomorrow, see what I can learn about these men and their real purpose here. The plan, simple as it was, provided structure that helped calm Lillian's nerves. That evening, though their usual easy companionship was strained by concern, they managed to maintain the routines that had come to define their shared life. Blake rode to Elko early the next morning, leaving Lillian with instructions to remain inside the cabin and keep his rifle close at hand. The town was unusually busy, with several unfamiliar horses tied outside the saloon despite the early hour. Jenkins at the general store proved to be a valuable source of information, as Blake had anticipated. The shopkeeper had a merchant's natural interest in newcomers, especially those who might bring business. Mining men, Jenkins confirmed when Blake casually inquired about the strangers. Been staying at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house for 3 days now. Tight-lipped about their specific interests, but they've been asking questions all over town. What kind of questions? Blake pressed. Jenkins leaned across the counter conspiratorially. Started with the usual property boundaries, who owns what land, local mineral rights. Then got more personal, particularly interested in folks who have settled here recently. A cold certainty settled in Blake's stomach. Anyone specific? Your place came up, Jenkins admitted. Specifically, they asked about your sister. When she arrived where she came from, said they were looking for investors' relatives, making sure company representatives were being honest about the region. And what did people tell them? Blake asked, keeping his voice neutral despite his growing concern. Jenkins shrugged. Not much to tell, is there? She arrived last summer, keeps to herself, same as you do, though. He hesitated. What? Blake prompted. Miller, runs the livery. He mentioned that no one recalled you ever speaking of family before she showed up. Said it was convenient timing, what with the mining interests suddenly taking notice of the region. Blake frowned. Meaning what exactly? Oh, nothing definite, Jenkins backpedaled. Just idle talk, but these mining fellows seemed mighty interested in that particular detail. Blake thanked Jenkins for the information and made his purchases quickly, eager to return to the ranch. As he loaded supplies onto his horse, he noticed Martin Wells and one of his companions watching from across the street, making no attempt to disguise their interest. The ride back to the ranch was tense, Blake pushing his horse harder than usual. He found Lillian waiting anxiously on the porch, rifle in hand as he'd instructed, her expression tight with worry. "What did you learn?" she asked as soon as he dismounted. Blake related Jenkins's information as they brought the supplies inside, confirming Lillian's worst fears. "They're asking specific questions about when you arrived and whether I ever mentioned family before. Could be coincidence, but it's not coincidence," Lillian interrupted, her voice flat with certainty. "It's how Howard operates. He uses business interests as cover for his personal vendettas." "You think this Wells person works for Crawford directly?" Blake asked. Lillian shook her head. "Probably not. Howard would use intermediaries, men who owe him favors or need his financial backing. They might not even know the real reason they're looking for me." Blake considered this information, weighing their options. "We could leave," he suggested. "Sell the ranch, head further west, California, like you originally planned." The offer surprised them both. Blake had built this place from nothing, poured 5 years of sweat and determination into making it viable. To suggest abandoning, it revealed more about his priorities than he'd intended to disclose. Lillian's expression softened, understanding the magnitude of what he proposed. "I can't ask that of you, Blake. This is your home." "It's just land," he replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Can find more elsewhere." For a moment, Lillian looked tempted by the possibility of a fresh start, far from Howard Crawford's reach, with Blake beside her. The thought created a flutter of something dangerous in her chest, something she'd forbidden herself to acknowledge during the months they'd lived and worked together. "No," she said finally. "Running would just start the cycle again. Besides, these men might not have definitive information yet. If we act normally, give them nothing to report back." Blake nodded, relieved in spite of himself. The ranch was more than property to him. It represented everything he'd built after the war, the peace he'd fought to create for himself. "We'll be careful. Limit trips to town. Watch for strangers." For the next week, they maintained heightened vigilance, Blake altering his usual routines to ensure Lillian was never alone for long periods. The caution seemed warranted when, 3 days after his visit to Elko, he spotted riders approaching from the east, the same 3 men, moving with purpose toward the ranch house. "They're coming," Blake called to Lillian, who was working in the kitchen garden. "Get inside, but act natural." "Nothing suspicious." Lillian nodded, gathering her basket of herbs with deliberate calm before walking unhurriedly to the cabin. Blake positioned himself by the corral, continuing to repair a section of fencing while watching the approaching riders from the corner of his eye. Wells led the group as before, raising a hand in greeting as they drew near. "Mr. Daniels, good afternoon." Blake straightened, setting his tools aside with measured movements. "Mr. Wells, didn't expect to see you again." Wells smiled, the expression calculated to appear friendly. "Reconsidered our offer, have you?" "No," Blake replied simply. "Still not interested in mining operations on my land." Wells dismounted, signaling his companions to remain on horseback. "Perhaps we could discuss it over coffee." "It's been a long ride, and I'm told your sister makes an excellent brew." The casual reference to Lillian raised Blake's hackles, but he maintained an outward calm. "She's busy with chores, and my answer remains the same, so there's nothing to discuss." "Actually," Wells said, his tone shifting subtly, "I think there might be quite a bit to discuss, Mr. Daniels. Or should I say, former Sergeant Daniels, 71st Pennsylvania Infantry." Blake stiffened, surprised by the reference to his military service. "That was a long time ago." "Indeed." Wells agreed smoothly. Almost as long ago as when your sister married Howard Crawford of St. Louis. Interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say? The direct mention of Crawford confirmed Blake's worst fears. He didn't bother denying the connection, knowing it would be futile. "What do you want, Wells?" "Simply to resolve a misunderstanding," Wells replied. "Mrs. Crawford left her husband under confused circumstances. Mr. Crawford is naturally concerned for his wife's welfare and wishes her to return home." "And if she doesn't wish to return?" Blake asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Wells spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "That would be unfortunate. Mr. Crawford is a man of considerable influence, even in territories as remote as Nevada. It would be a shame if legal complications were to arise regarding your land claims. For instance." Before Blake could respond, the cabin door opened and Lillian emerged, her posture straight and her expression composed despite the fear Blake could see in her eyes. "Mr. Wells," she greeted, her voice steadier than Blake would have expected. "I believe you're discussing me as if I weren't present to speak for myself." Wells turned, studying Lillian with open interest. "Mrs. Crawford, your husband will be relieved to know you're alive and well." "I'm Mrs. Crawford in legal documents only," Lillian replied coldly. "And I have no intention of returning to St. Louis or to Howard." Wells sighed, as if dealing with a difficult child. "I understand you may have had disagreements with your husband. All marriages have their challenges. But Mr. Crawford is prepared to forgive your impulsive departure and restore you to your proper position in his household." "Forgive me," Lillian repeated, incredulity breaking through her composure, "for fleeing a man who treated me as property to be used and damaged at will." Blake moved to stand beside her, his presence a silent statement of support. Wells noted the movement, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I see Mr. Daniels has been influential in your decision-making," Wells observed. "Perhaps he's unaware of the potential consequences of interfering in a marital dispute. The law is quite clear on a husband's rights regarding his wife." "The law doesn't extend to torture," Blake stated flatly, "which is what Crawford's treatment amounted to." Wells shrugged. "A matter of perspective, and one for the courts to decide. In the meantime, Mrs. Crawford, I strongly suggest you consider your position carefully. Your husband has authorized me to offer you safe passage back to St. Louis with no recriminations for your adventure. And if I refuse?" Lillian asked, though she clearly knew the answer. "Then Mr. Crawford will be forced to pursue more formal means of recovering his wife," Wells replied, "including legal action against those who have harbored you illegally. Mr. Daniels could find himself facing serious charges." Blake had heard enough. "Time for you to leave, Wells. You've delivered your message." Wells studied them both for a moment longer before nodding. "Very well. We'll remain in Elko for 3 more days. Sufficient time for Mrs. Crawford to reconsider her options." He tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Good day to you both." The 3 men mounted and rode away, leaving Blake and Lillian standing side by side in the yard, the threat of their visit hanging in the air between them. "He'll do it," Lillian said once the riders were out of earshot. "Howard will destroy you to punish me. He's done it before to others who tried to help me." Blake turned to face her, his expression grim but determined. "Let him try. This isn't St. Louis and I'm not easily intimidated." "This isn't your fight," Lillian insisted, anguish clear in her voice. "I should never have stayed, never put you at risk." "It became my fight the moment I found you on my land," Blake replied simply. The statement hung between them, laden with meaning neither had fully acknowledged until that moment. Lillian looked up at him, really seeing him perhaps for the first time not just as her rescuer or the partner with whom she'd built a life on this remote ranch, but as a man who had chosen to stand beside her against dangers that were not his own. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk everything for me?" Blake struggled to find words for what had developed between them over the months of shared work and quiet evenings, the gradual transformation of obligation into something deeper and more essential. "Because you belong here," he finally said, the words inadequate but honest. "With the land, he hesitated, "with me." The admission changed something in the air between them, an invisible barrier dissolving as Lillian reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered skin. "I do," she whispered. "God help me, I do." The kiss that followed was tentative at first, both of them aware of crossing a boundary that could never be re-established. Then hesitation gave way to certainty as Blake's arms encircled Lillian, drawing her closer as her hands wound around his neck. When they finally separated, Blake rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll find a way through this, together." The declaration was a promise, one Lillian accepted with a nod, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Together. That evening they made plans by lamplight, weighing options that had seemed unthinkable just days before. The simplest solution, Lillian's return to St. Louis, was dismissed without discussion. Whatever consequences might come, surrender to Howard Crawford was not among them. "We could still leave," Blake suggested, though with less conviction than before. "Head for California or even Oregon territory." Lillian shook her head. "Running won't stop him. Howard would just send men after us and we'd lose whatever advantage we have in being on land, you know." "Then we stay and fight," Blake concluded. "But how? The law is technically on Crawford's side, at least regarding his claim to you as his wife." Lillian was silent for a long moment, considering. "There might be another way, one that would require significant change for both of us." Blake waited, sensing the weight of what she was about to propose. "Divorce," Lillian said finally. "If I could obtain a divorce from Howard, his legal claim to me would end." Blake frowned, understanding the difficulties inherent in such a plan. Divorces are hard to come by, especially for women, and Nevada's not exactly known for its progressive courts. "Actually," Lillian replied, "Nevada has some of the most lenient divorce laws in the country. 6 months residency and grounds of cruelty are sufficient." "I've been here 8 months now." "How do you know this?" Blake asked, surprised by her knowledge. A small, sad smile crossed Lillian's face. "I researched every state and territory while planning my escape. Nevada was always my destination, not California. The aunt in Sacramento was a contingency plan, nothing more." The revelation surprised Blake, though it made sense in retrospect. Lillian had been planning not just an escape but a permanent severance from Crawford all along. "Even with Nevada's laws," Blake pointed out, "you'd need evidence of cruelty. Your word against his might not be enough, especially if he sends lawyers to contest it." "I have evidence," Lillian said quietly. "Letters from a physician who treated my injuries, correspondence from Howard that contains veiled threats. I kept them hidden before I left." Blake nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form. "So we file for divorce before Wells can report back to Crawford, force the issue into Nevada courts rather than allowing him to pursue it from Missouri." "Yes," Lillian agreed, "but there's more to consider." She hesitated, then continued with determination. "If I obtain a divorce, I'll have no legal protection. As a single woman without family, I'd be vulnerable to Howard finding other means to control me." Blake understood immediately what she wasn't saying directly. "Unless you were married again." "To someone else." The words hung between them, both a practical solution and something far more significant. Lillian met his gaze steadily, allowing him to see both her fear and her hope. It would have to be convincing, she said softly. Not just a legal arrangement, but a real marriage. One that no court could question or invalidate. Real in every way, Blake agreed, his voice rough with emotion he no longer attempted to conceal. Lillian nodded, her expression a complex mixture of vulnerability and determination. Yes, in every way. The decision made, they worked quickly. The following morning, Blake rode to Elko alone, seeking out the town's only attorney, a former miner named Harrington, who had found law books more profitable than gold panning. Harrington listened to Blake's carefully edited explanation with professional interest, asking pointed questions about Lillian's residency and the evidence she possessed of Crawford's cruelty. When satisfied, he drafted the initial divorce petition, scheduling a hearing before the circuit judge who would arrive in Elko the following week. "Timing's in your favor," Harrington observed as he filed the paperwork. "Judge Wilson is known for granting divorces when cruelty is proven. Not a sentimental man." "And if someone contests the petition?" Blake asked, thinking of Wells and his threats. Harrington's expression grew serious. "That complicates matters. If the husband appears with counsel, it becomes a legal battle that could drag on for months. You mentioned he's wealthy." Blake nodded grimly. "Then he can afford better lawyers than Judge Wilson typically sees," Harrington concluded. "But possession is 9/10 of the law, as they say. Mrs. Davis is here, established on your ranch. Her husband is in Missouri. That counts for something, especially in Nevada." Armed with this qualified assurance, Blake completed his errands in town with heightened awareness, noting that Wells and his companions appeared to be absent from Elko. Whether they'd already departed for St. Louis or were simply away on other business remained unclear. When Blake returned to the ranch, he found Lillian waiting anxiously, her relief at his appearance palpable. "What did the attorney say?" she asked as soon as he entered the cabin. Blake relayed Harrington's cautious optimism, explaining the schedule for the upcoming hearing. "We'll need to bring your evidence. The judge arrives next Tuesday." Lillian nodded, absorbing the information. "And Wells, did you see him or his men?" "No sign of them," Blake replied. "Could mean anything." They spent the evening reviewing Lillian's evidence letters she'd kept hidden in a small pouch sewn into the lining of her dress, the same one she'd been wearing when Blake found her. The documents painted a damning picture of Howard Crawford, a man who maintained a respectable public face while privately terrorizing his wife. "Will it be enough?" Lillian asked, staring at the small collection of papers that represented her only hope for freedom. Blake wished he could offer absolute certainty, but honesty compelled him to acknowledge the reality of their situation. "I don't know, but we'll present the strongest case possible." The days before the hearing passed in a state of heightened alertness, both of them watching for any sign of Wells's return. Blake altered his routines, keeping his rifle closer at hand and ensuring Lillian was never alone for long periods. They discussed contingency plans, including a potential rapid departure should Crawford himself appear before the hearing could take place. Yet beneath the practical preparations ran a current of deeper significance, the acknowledgement of feelings that had developed between them over months of shared work and quiet companionship, now given voice by necessity. Their conversations in the evenings took on new dimensions, touching on hopes and plans that extended beyond the immediate crisis. "What was your life before the war?" Lillian asked one night as they sat before the fire, the spring chill still requiring warmth after sunset. Blake was silent for a moment, revisiting memories he seldom allowed himself to examine. "Simpler. Worked my father's farm in Pennsylvania. Had notions of attending university, eventually had a teacher who thought I showed promise with mathematics. What happened to those plans? Lillian asked gently. War came, Blake replied with simple finality. Then father died while I was fighting. Mother had passed years before. Farm was sold to pay debts. He shrugged. Came west afterward. Seemed as good a direction as any. Lillian nodded, understanding the unspoken weight of his experiences. Do you ever regret it? Coming here, I mean. Blake considered the question seriously. No, found something here I needed, quiet, space to think without other people's expectations. He glanced at her. Until you arrived. Lillian smiled, acknowledging the gentle teasing. Disrupting your carefully constructed solitude. Yes, Blake agreed. Thankfully. The admission, simple as it was, created a moment of connection that lingered between them as the fire burned low and the night deepened around the small cabin. Tuesday arrived with a clarity of purpose that drove away the uncertainty of the preceding days. They rose before dawn, dressing with care in their best clothing, limited, as those options were before beginning the journey to Elko. Lillian wore the dress she'd purchased during their first trip to town together, now altered and carefully maintained, while Blake donned the single suit he owned, reserved for rare, formal occasions. The courthouse in Elko was little more than a large room above the sheriff's office, but it represented the full authority of territorial law. Judge Wilson, a stern man with a reputation for efficiency rather than compassion, had already begun proceedings when they arrived, dealing quickly with minor cases before calling Lillian's petition. Harrington presented their case with professional detachment, submitting Lillian's evidence and calling both her and Blake as witnesses. Lillian spoke with quiet dignity about her marriage to Crawford, describing the progressive pattern of control and abuse without embellishment, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. When Blake took the stand, he recounted finding Lillian near death on his property, her condition consistent with someone who had fled desperate circumstances. His testimony, delivered in the straightforward manner of a man unaccustomed to subterfuge, carried weight with the judge, who listened attentively before asking several pointed questions about their current living arrangement. And you're prepared to support Mrs. Crawford should this divorce be granted? Judge Wilson asked Blake directly. I am, Blake replied without hesitation. In what capacity? The judge pressed, his expression giving nothing away. Blake met the older man's gaze steadily. As her husband, Your Honor. We intend to marry once the divorce is finalized. The judge nodded, making a note in his ledger. And you understand, Mrs. Crawford, that by Nevada territorial law, a divorced woman cannot remarry until 6 months have passed following the decree. Lillian's composure faltered momentarily before she regained control. I wasn't aware of that specific provision, Your Honor. Judge Wilson studied her carefully. It's designed to prevent hasty decisions and ensure the finality of the divorce is understood by all parties. Do you still wish to proceed? Yes, Your Honor, Lillian replied without hesitation. The waiting period changes nothing about my need to be legally separated from Howard Crawford. The judge considered this, then turned his attention to Harrington. Has notice been properly served to the respondent in this matter? Notice was published in accordance with territorial requirements for an absent respondent, Harrington confirmed. Additionally, we have confirmation that Mr. Crawford is aware of these proceedings through his representatives who recently visited the territory. Judge Wilson frowned. Representatives, explain. Harrington glanced at Blake before continuing. Men claiming to represent a mining consortium visited Mr. Daniels's ranch last week, Your Honor. During their visit, they revealed knowledge of Mrs. Crawford's presence and conveyed threats regarding her return to St. Louis. Were these threats documented? The judge asked. Verbal only, Blake interjected, but witnessed by both myself and Miss Crawford. Judge Wilson made another note before addressing the courtroom at large. Is there anyone present who represents the interests of Howard Crawford in this matter? The question was met with silence, which the judge allowed to extend for a full minute before nodding with apparent satisfaction. Very well. Having reviewed the evidence presented and heard testimony from both the petitioner and witnesses, this court finds sufficient grounds to grant a divorce on the basis of extreme cruelty. Lillian's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the courtroom as the judge continued. Lillian Crawford is hereby granted a divorce from Howard Crawford. As per territorial statute, neither party may remarry until 6 months from this date. He fixed Lillian with a stern gaze. I suggest you use that time to establish your independence, Mrs. Crawford. The court looks unfavorably on women who seek divorce merely to exchange one husband for another. Yes, Your Honor, Lillian replied, though Blake could see the slight trembling of her hands as she clutched her small reticule. The judge's gavel fell with a sharp crack, and just like that, Lillian Crawford was legally free from her husband for the first time in nearly 6 years. Outside the courthouse, spring sunshine bathed the dusty street in golden light as Blake, Lillian, and Harrington discussed the implications of the judge's ruling. It's a favorable outcome, Harrington assured them. Clean break, no conditions beyond the standard waiting period. What happens when Crawford learns of the divorce? Blake asked, voicing the concern that had been uppermost in his mind throughout the proceedings. Harrington's expression grew serious. Legally, he has limited recourse. The divorce is valid under territorial law, however. He hesitated. Practically speaking, a man of his resources could still cause problems, Lillian finished for him, her voice steady despite the worry evident in her eyes. Precisely, Harrington agreed. I'd advise maintaining vigilance, particularly during the next few months. Once you're remarried, he nodded toward Blake, Crawford's legal avenues will be further constrained. The 6-month waiting period stretched before them like an eternity, a time of vulnerability neither had anticipated. As they rode back to the ranch, Blake's mind worked through the practical implications, weighing options and contingencies with the tactical assessment he'd developed during the war. We'll need to be careful, he said as the ranch came into view. Especially when I'm away from the property. Lillian nodded, her expression resolute. I've survived Howard for years. I can manage 6 more months. Her courage, displayed not in grand gestures but in the quiet determination to face each day's challenges, stirred something profound in Blake's chest. This woman, who had endured brutality and near starvation, who had rebuilt herself on his remote ranch through sheer force of will, had become essential to him in ways he was only beginning to fully comprehend. That evening, as they ate supper in the warm kitchen, Blake made a decision. Rising from the table, he retrieved something from his room before returning to kneel beside Lillian's chair, holding out a small wooden box, the same one he'd carved for her at Christmas. Open it, he urged softly. Lillian took the box with questioning eyes, lifting the lid to reveal a simple gold band nestled inside. Her breath caught as she looked from the ring to Blake's face. It was my mother's, he explained. Only thing I kept after the farm was sold. Blake, Lillian whispered, understanding the significance of the gesture. I can't, you can, he interrupted gently. Not legally, not for 6 months, but between us a promise. He took her hand, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. I'm asking you to be my wife, Lillian. Not just in name or for protection, but because I love you. The words, spoken plainly in the quiet kitchen, held all the weight of Blake's character straightforward, honest, without embellishment or pretense. Lillian's eyes filled with tears as she slipped the ring onto her finger, where it sat a bit loose but undeniably right. "Yes," she replied simply. "With all my heart, yes." Their kiss sealed the promise, a private commitment that would sustain them through the months of waiting. Whatever challenges Howard Crawford might yet bring to their door, they would face them together no longer as rescuer and rescued, but as equals who had chosen each other deliberately and with full awareness of what that choice entailed. Spring deepened into summer as they settled into a new rhythm, their days filled with the work of the ranch and their evenings with plans for a shared future. Blake expanded the garden, building a proper greenhouse using glass purchased from Elko at considerable expense. Lillian learned to shoot with Blake's patient instruction, developing enough proficiency to protect herself, should the need arise. Word of Lillian's divorce spread through Elko County with the inevitable speed of frontier gossip, but to their surprise, the reaction was largely supportive. The territorial mindset valued self-determination and resilience, qualities Lillian had demonstrated in abundance. Even Jenkins at the general store, typically reserved in his manner, offered gruff congratulations when Blake next visited town. "Heard the judge ruled in your sister's favor," he said, emphasizing sister with a knowing look. "Good outcome. Lady deserves better than some Missouri dandy who couldn't keep her happy." Blake accepted the comment with a nod, neither confirming nor correcting the widespread assumption that he and Lillian's relationship had developed outside the bounds of propriety. Let people think what they would, the truth was between them and God alone. It was in late July, as they harvested the first substantial yield from the expanded garden, that trouble finally found them again. Blake had ridden to the eastern boundary to check on a section of fence reported damaged by a neighbor, when he spotted riders approaching from the direction of Elko, not the now familiar figures of Wells and his companions, but a larger group, moving with the determined pace of men on business. Blake altered his course to intercept them before they could reach the ranch house, where Lillian was working alone. As he drew closer, he could make out 5 riders, led by a man whose formal attire and straight-backed posture marked him as someone unaccustomed to frontier conditions. "That's far enough," Blake called when they were within earshot, his hand resting near his holstered revolver. "State your business." The lead rider reined in, studying Blake with cold assessment. He was perhaps 50, with features that might have been handsome if not for the hardness evident in every line of his face and the calculating look in his pale blue eyes. "I'm looking for Lillian Crawford," the man stated without preamble, his accent carrying the refined tones of Eastern education. "I believe you know where to find her." Blake kept his expression neutral, though his heart rate increased at the confirmation of his worst fears. "There's no one by that name here." "Let's dispense with the charade, Mr. Daniels," the man replied, impatience edging his voice. "I am Howard Crawford, and I've come for my wife." Blake had imagined this moment many times over the past months, rehearsing responses and strategies. Now that it had arrived, he found himself oddly calm, the familiar clarity of imminent conflict settling over him like an old coat. "Your former wife," Blake corrected, emphasizing the critical distinction. "The divorce was granted 3 months ago, legal and binding under Nevada territorial law." Crawford's expression tightened, though he betrayed no surprise at the information. "A technicality that will be remedied once we return to Missouri. Nevada has no jurisdiction over a marriage performed in St. Louis." "The courts disagree," Blake replied evenly. "Lillian is no longer your wife. She's free to make her own decisions. And she's decided to attach herself to a rancher in the middle of nowhere." Crawford's tone dripped with disdain as he surveyed Blake's modest property. "How?" Convenient for you both. Blake ignored the insinuation. I'll give Lillian your message. If she wishes to speak with you, that will be her choice. Crawford's facade of civility slipped, revealing the harder man beneath. You misunderstand the situation, Daniels. I haven't come to negotiate or request. I've come to collect what's mine. People aren't property, Blake stated, his voice dangerously quiet. Not even wives, especially not former wives. A progressive viewpoint, Crawford observed with mock approval. Unfortunately, the law tends to favor traditional interpretations of marriage. The Nevada divorce will be contested in Missouri courts, where I have considerably more influence than in this territory. Blake maintained his position, physically blocking the path to the ranch house. That's a legal matter for another day. For now, you're on private property without invitation. I'm asking you to leave. Crawford studied him for a long moment, assessing the man who had upended his carefully constructed world. My men tell me you're a formidable opponent, Daniels. War veteran, experienced with weapons, knows this land intimately. He smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. But every man has vulnerabilities. The threat, though veiled, was unmistakable. Blake's hand tightened on his revolver, but he kept it holstered, unwilling to escalate the confrontation with 4 armed men backing Crawford. Threatening a man on his own property is unwise, Blake replied calmly. The law here tends to favor those defending their homes. Crawford waved away the warning. I'm simply making an observation. Consider it friendly advice. He turned his horse, signaling his men to do the same. I'll be in Elko for the remainder of the week. Tell Lillian I expect to see her voluntarily by Friday. Otherwise, our next conversation will be considerably less cordial. Blake watched them ride away, maintaining his position until they were well out of sight before urging his horse toward the ranch at a gallop. He found Lillian in the garden, her face paling at his expression even before he spoke. Crawford's here, he said without preamble, dismounting quickly. Just met him and 4 men on the eastern boundary. Lillian's hands trembled as she set down her garden tools. What did he want? What you'd expect, Blake replied grimly. Says he's contesting the divorce in Missouri courts and wants you to return with him voluntarily. Or. Lillian pressed, knowing Howard Crawford never made simple requests, or our next conversation will be less cordial according to him. Blake helped her to her feet, guiding her toward the cabin. He's staying in Elko until Friday, expecting you to come to him. Inside, Lillian moved with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis, gathering essential items into a small bag. We need to leave, now before he returns with more men. Blake caught her hands, stilling their frantic movement. Lillian, stop, think. Running is exactly what he expects, what he wants. It would validate his claim that the divorce was fraudulent, that you're a confused wife who needs his protection. Then what do we do? She asked, her eyes searching his face for the certainty she needed. Blake considered their options, limited as they were. We stand our ground, on our property with witnesses nearby. Make any confrontation public, not private. Lillian nodded slowly, recognizing the strategy. Howard operated best in shadows, using his public reputation as a shield for private cruelty. Exposing his true nature in front of witnesses would be his greatest vulnerability. We'll go to Elko tomorrow, Blake decided. Together in daylight. Visit Harrington first, ensure he's aware of Crawford's threats. Then handle any necessary business openly, where Crawford can't act without revealing himself. The plan was risky, but gave them better odds than attempting to flee or waiting for Crawford to return to the ranch with greater numbers. They spent the evening preparing, cleaning Blake's weapons and discussing contingencies for various scenarios. Neither suggested separating whatever came. They would face it side by side. Morning brought clear skies and the particular quality of light that made Nevada's landscape appear both harsh and beautiful. They set out for Elko early, Blake riding slightly ahead, his rifle visible across his saddle. Lillian followed on the mare she'd learned to ride in the past months, her posture straight despite the fear Blake knew she must be feeling. Elko was unusually busy when they arrived, with wagons lining the main street and an atmosphere of heightened activity. Blake scanned the boardwalks as they rode toward Harrington's office, alert for any sign of Crawford or his men. Cattle auction, Lillian observed, noting the groups of ranchers gathered outside the stockyards. Good timing. More witnesses. Blake nodded, appreciating her quick strategic thinking. They dismounted outside Harrington's office, securing their horses before entering the small building that served as the attorney's professional space. Harrington looked up from his desk with surprise as they entered. "Daniels, Mrs. Crawford, didn't expect to see you in town today." "We have a situation," Blake replied, closing the door behind them. Howard Crawford arrived yesterday, making threats and demanding Lillian return with him to Missouri. Harrington's expression grew serious as he gestured for them to sit. "I was afraid this might happen." "What specifically did he threaten?" Blake recounted the encounter while Lillian added details about Crawford's typical methods of intimidation. Harrington listened attentively, making notes before leaning back with a thoughtful expression. "The divorce is legally sound," he confirmed. "Crawford can file appeals or contests, but Nevada's jurisdiction is clear. Lillian was a resident for the required period, and the grounds were well established. Howard doesn't respect legal boundaries when they interfere with his plans," Lillian pointed out. "He'll use whatever means necessary to get what he wants." Harrington nodded gravely. "Which is why we need to ensure any confrontation happens publicly, with witnesses who can attest to his behavior." He paused, considering options. "The cattle auction provides an opportunity. Most of the county will be there, including the sheriff and Judge Wilson, who's overseeing a property dispute." The strategy aligned with Blake's thinking to force any confrontation into the open, where Crawford's reputation would constrain his actions. They spent the next hour reviewing legal documents, with Harrington providing copies of the divorce decree and explaining exactly which aspects Crawford might attempt to challenge. Armed with this information, Blake and Lillian left the attorney's office and made their way toward the general store, maintaining deliberate visibility as they moved through town. Blake noted several unfamiliar men watching their progress with too much interest to be casual observers. Crawford's hired help, no doubt, reporting their movements. Jenkins greeted them with his usual gruff manner as they entered the store, though his eyes held a warning Blake immediately recognized. "Daniels, Mrs. Crawford, busy day." "Indeed," Blake agreed, understanding the shopkeeper's subtle message. "Just picking up a few necessities." "Had an interesting visitor this morning," Jenkins continued, weighing coffee beans with practiced movements. "Gentleman from St. Louis, asking all manner of questions about you both." Lillian tensed beside Blake, but maintained her composure. "Did he find the answers he was looking for?" Jenkins shrugged. "Told him what everyone knows, that you're a divorced woman making a new start, as is your right under territorial law." He wrapped the coffee in brown paper with deliberate care. "Also mentioned that folks around here tend to respect a woman's choices, especially when they're made to escape a bad situation." The support, though obliquely offered, reinforced Blake's hope that Crawford would find Elko less hospitable to his plans than anticipated. The frontier had its own code of justice, one that sometimes valued right action over strict legality. They completed their purchases efficiently, with Blake arranging for delivery rather than loading the supplies onto their horses. The precaution would leave them unencumbered if quick movement became necessary. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, Blake immediately spotted Crawford across the street, watching them with cold calculation. Beside him stood Martin Wells and 3 other men, the same group that had visited the ranch months earlier. "He's there," Blake murmured, guiding Lillian with a gentle hand at her elbow. "Across the street. Don't look directly." Lillian nodded almost imperceptibly, keeping her gaze forward as they moved toward the center of town where the auction was underway. The crowd provided both visibility and protection, too many witnesses for Crawford to act rashly, but enough cover for Blake and Lillian to maintain some distance. They had nearly reached the auction grounds when Crawford made his move, crossing the street with purposeful strides, his men following at a discreet distance. Blake stopped, positioning himself slightly in front of Lillian without completely blocking her from view. "Mrs. Crawford," Howard called, his voice carrying enough to draw attention from nearby townspeople. "A word, if you please." Lillian stepped forward, her chin lifted in a display of courage Blake knew must have cost her dearly. "Mr. Crawford, I have nothing to say to you." Crawford smiled thinly, maintaining a veneer of civility despite the cold anger evident in his eyes. "Now, Lillian, that's hardly the proper greeting for your husband after such a long separation." "Former husband," Lillian corrected firmly. "Our marriage was legally dissolved 3 months ago by Judge Wilson." The public acknowledgement of the divorce caused a ripple of interest among the gathering onlookers. Crawford's smile tightened as he became aware of the attention their conversation was attracting. "A misunderstanding that will be rectified," he replied smoothly. "Your confused state led to an unfortunate legal error, one that will be corrected once we return to St. Louis, where our marriage remains valid." Blake observed the exchange silently, noting the townspeople's reactions. Several of the local ranchers had moved closer, their expressions revealing more sympathy for Lillian than for the well-dressed Easterner making claims on her. "The divorce is legal and binding," Lillian stated, her voice steady despite her visible tension. "I am no longer your wife, Howard. I have established a new life here and I intend to remain." Crawford's facade of reasonableness slipped slightly, his voice hardening. "A life with him," he jerked his head toward Blake. "This rancher who's filled your head with nonsense about independence. Think carefully about the consequences of your choices, Lillian." "Are you threatening Mrs. Crawford, sir?" The new voice came from behind them, where Sheriff Tanner had approached unnoticed during their exchange. The lawman's hand rested casually near his holstered revolver as he surveyed the scene. Crawford recovered quickly, smoothing his expression into one of concerned dignity. "Not at all, Sheriff. I'm attempting to help my wife, who left St. Louis in a state of considerable confusion. Her health has always been delicate." The insinuation that Lillian was mentally unstable drew murmurs from the crowd, though not the supportive ones Crawford might have hoped for. In the months since her arrival, Lillian had established herself as clear-headed and capable, earning the respect of Elko's small community. "Seems pretty clear-minded to me," observed Jenkins, who had emerged from his store to join the growing audience. "Clear enough to get a legal divorce from a man she had good reason to fear." Crawford's eyes narrowed at the shopkeeper's intervention. "You know nothing of our private affairs." "Know what I see," Jenkins replied bluntly. "Lady came here half-starved, worked hard to build a new life. Now you show up making demands and accusations." He spat deliberately into the dirt. "Doesn't sit right." Sheriff Tanner stepped between Crawford and Lillian, his posture casual but his intent clear. "Mr. Crawford, I understand you're staying at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. I suggest you return there while Mrs. Crawford and Mr. Daniels complete their business in town. This is a private matter between a man and his wife, Crawford insisted, his control visibly slipping as the confrontation failed to proceed as he'd planned. I have legal rights that this community is interfering with. Not according to Judge Wilson's ruling, Sheriff Tanner replied evenly, which I witnessed personally. Mrs. Crawford is legally divorced under territorial law. Crawford's gaze shifted to Blake, hatred plainly visible now. This isn't finished, Daniels. There are other ways to resolve such disputes. The threat hung in the air as Crawford turned and walked away, his men falling in behind him. The crowd gradually dispersed, though several townspeople approached Lillian with quiet words of support before returning to the auction or their other business. Sheriff Tanner remained, his weathered face serious as he addressed Blake directly. Crawford's not the type to accept defeat easily. I'd watch your back, Daniels. Planning to, Blake assured him. Thank you for stepping in. Tanner nodded. Judge Wilson mentioned the case, said the evidence was compelling. He glanced at Lillian with gruff sympathy. Lady deserves a fresh start. But be careful, men like Crawford play by different rules than the rest of us. The warning was unnecessary, but appreciated. Blake and Lillian completed their remaining errands quickly, maintaining awareness of their surroundings at all times. Crawford and his men were nowhere to be seen, having apparently retreated to the boarding house as the sheriff suggested. Their return journey to the ranch was undertaken in watchful silence, both scanning the landscape for any sign of pursuit or ambush. Only when they crossed onto their property did Blake feel some of the tension ease from his shoulders. He won't give up, Lillian said as they unsaddled the horses in the small barn. Today was just the opening move. Blake nodded, knowing she was right. We'll be ready. The town's support helps makes it harder for him to act openly. Howard rarely acts openly, Lillian replied grimly. It's what he does in secret that concerns me. That night, they took extra precautions checking and rechecking the cabin's locks, keeping weapons close at hand, taking turns to rest while the other maintained watch. The peace they had built over months of shared work and growing affection felt suddenly precarious, threatened by the shadow Crawford had cast over their lives. Morning came without incident, bringing with it a cautious hope that perhaps Crawford had recognized the futility of his position and decided to return east. Blake tended to the livestock while Lillian prepared breakfast, their routine resuming with only the heightened vigilance to mark the change in circumstances. It was mid-afternoon when Blake spotted smoke rising from the direction of their eastern boundary, too much smoke for a controlled burn, especially in the dry conditions of late summer. Fire, he called to Lillian, who was working in the garden. Eastern fence line. She looked up, alarm crossing her features as she saw the dark column rising against the clear sky. Crawford, possibly, Blake acknowledged, already moving toward the barn where firefighting tools were stored. Or just bad luck. Either way, we need to contain it before it reaches the house or livestock. They worked with the practiced efficiency of partners who understood each other's capabilities, gathering wet sacks, shovels, and buckets before riding toward the blaze. As they drew closer, Blake's suspicions hardened into certainty the fire had been deliberately set at multiple points along the fence line, with the prevailing wind positioned to drive it toward the ranch buildings. Back to the house, he ordered, assessing the situation quickly. We need to create a firebreak closer in. This is spreading too fast to fight at the source. Lillian didn't argue, recognizing both the danger and the logic of his decision. They raced back to the ranch, where Blake outlined a hasty plan to clear a wide strip of land between the approaching fire and their most essential structures. For the next 2 hours, they worked frantically plowing furrows to create bare earth barriers, wetting down the cabin's roof and walls, moving livestock to the western pasture away from the advancing flames. The physical labor was exhausting, but the alternative, losing everything they had built together, drove them beyond normal endurance. As dusk approached, they stood side by side, watching the fire burn itself out against their hastily constructed defenses. Smoke stung their eyes and coated their throats, but the essential structures remained intact: the cabin, barn, and chicken coops preserved by their efforts. "We'll lose the eastern pasture and part of the cornfield," Blake assessed, surveying the damage with grim practicality. "But the core of the ranch is safe." Lillian's soot-streaked face revealed her exhaustion, but her eyes held the same determination that had carried her through every challenge since her arrival. "He's testing us, seeing how we respond to pressure." Blake nodded, recognizing the tactical assessment as accurate. "Testing our defenses, looking for vulnerabilities. And now he knows we can protect the ranch from fire," Lillian observed, her mind clearly running along the same strategic lines as Blake's. "He'll try something else next." The prediction proved accurate sooner than either expected. The following morning, Blake discovered that someone had opened the gates to the western pasture during the night, allowing their small herd of cattle to scatter. The timing suggested the action had been taken while they were occupied fighting the fire on the eastern boundary, a coordinated attack designed to maximize damage to their livelihood. "Two-pronged approach," Blake muttered as they rode out to recover the strays. "Fire to draw our attention east while they struck from the west." Lillian nodded grimly, her eyes scanning the horizon for signs of their missing livestock. "Howard always was methodical in his cruelty. This is his style: systematic dismantling of security and resources." They spent the day tracking and recovering the scattered cattle, finding most within a few miles of the ranch. By nightfall, they had accounted for all but 3 animals, an acceptable loss given the circumstances, but still a blow to their carefully managed resources. That night, they took turns standing watch, neither willing to leave the ranch unguarded after the coordinated attacks. Blake used the quiet hours to consider their options, weighing the various courses of action available to them. "We could request help from neighbors," he suggested when Lillian relieved him at midnight. "Safety in numbers," she shook her head. "That's what Howard wants: to force us to reveal our vulnerability, to make our private conflict public in ways that reflect poorly on us, not him. He's patient. He can afford to wait until we're isolated or desperate." Blake recognized the truth in her assessment. Crawford's strategy was clear: a war of attrition, designed to wear them down physically, financially, and emotionally, until Lillian saw returning with him as the only viable option. "Then we change the terms of engagement," Blake decided. "Stop reacting to his moves and make one of our own." Lillian looked at him questioningly. "What did you have in mind?" Blake outlined his plan, bold in its simplicity, but carrying significant risks for them both. Lillian listened without interruption, her expression revealing both concern and growing determination. "It could work," she acknowledged when he finished. "But if it fails?" "Then we face the consequences together," Blake replied, taking her hand, "as we plan to do regardless." The following morning, they rode to Elko with purpose, having prepared carefully for what might be their most important confrontation with Howard Crawford. Blake had shaved his usual beard and donned his best clothing, while Lillian wore her finest dress, the one she had purchased specifically for court appearances. Their destination was not Harrington's office or the general store, but the small church at the edge of town. Pastor Mitchell, a former miner who had found religion after a near-death experience in a cave-in, met them at the door with the solemn dignity of his office. "Mr. Daniels, Mrs. Crawford," he greeted, ushering them inside. "Sheriff Tanner explained your situation. Are you certain this is the course you wish to take?" "We are," Blake confirmed, his hand steady on Lillian's arm. "Is Judge Wilson here?" The pastor nodded, leading them to the small room behind the altar where the territorial judge waited, his expression serious as he reviewed the documents before him. "Daniels," he acknowledged with a nod. "Mrs. Crawford. Sheriff Tanner has informed me of the ongoing harassment you've experienced since the divorce was granted." "Yes, Your Honor," Lillian replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "My former husband refuses to accept the court's ruling and has resorted to increasingly dangerous tactics to force my return to St. Louis." Judge Wilson nodded, his stern countenance revealing nothing of his thoughts. "And you believe this action will resolve the situation?" "It establishes a clear legal status that even Missouri courts would be forced to recognize," Blake answered, "and demonstrates our commitment beyond any claim of temporary arrangement or confusion." The judge considered this, then nodded again. "Very well. I've reviewed your petition for expedited marriage license due to extraordinary circumstances. Given the documented threats and property damage, I'm granting the exception to the usual waiting period required after divorce." Relief washed through Blake at the judge's words. Their plan to marry immediately rather than waiting for the standard 6-month period following Lillian's divorce had been a gamble. Nevada law allowed exceptions in extraordinary circumstances, but such exceptions were rarely granted. "Thank you, Your Honor," Lillian said softly. "Don't thank me yet," Judge Wilson replied pragmatically. "This may resolve your legal status, but it won't necessarily end Crawford's determination to reclaim what he considers his property. Men of his type rarely accept defeat gracefully." "We understand the risks," Blake assured him. "This is our choice, made with full awareness of the potential consequences." The judge studied them both for a moment longer, then gestured to Pastor Mitchell. "Proceed with the ceremony, then. I'll witness and sign the certificate myself." The wedding that followed was brief and unadorned, with only the essential elements required to create a legally binding union. Blake and Lillian exchanged vows in clear, steady voices, their hands joined before God and the representatives of territorial law. When Pastor Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife, Blake felt a sense of rightness that transcended the strategic nature of their timing. This marriage would have happened regardless of Crawford's threats, perhaps in spring as they'd originally planned, with more preparation and celebration. But the essential truth of their commitment remained unchanged by the accelerated timeline. The signing of the marriage certificate was witnessed by Judge Wilson, Sheriff Tanner, and Pastor Mitchell, 3 of the most respected authorities in Elko County. No one, not even Howard Crawford with his Eastern connections, could challenge the legitimacy of a union so carefully documented and officially observed. As they emerged from the church into the bright sunlight of late morning, Blake was unsurprised to find a small crowd gathered outside. News traveled quickly in Elko, and their arrival at the church had apparently attracted attention. Jenkins stood at the front of the onlookers, his typically gruff expression softened into something approaching satisfaction. "About time, Daniels," he called. "Been obvious to everyone for months." The good-natured comment drew laughter and nods of agreement from the assembled townspeople, many of whom stepped forward to offer congratulations. The community's support, displayed so openly, reinforced the message Blake and Lillian hoped to send to Crawford. They were no longer isolated targets, but members of a society that recognized and defended their union. Sheriff Tanner approached as the well-wishers began to disperse. "Crawford's still at the boarding house," he informed them quietly. "One of my deputies is watching the place. Thought you should know he hasn't left town yet." Blake nodded his thanks for the information. "We expected as much. Is Harrington ready?" "Waiting at his office," the sheriff confirmed. "Documents prepared as you requested." With a final word of thanks to Pastor Mitchell, Blake and Lillian made their way to Harrington's office, where the attorney greeted them with formal congratulations before presenting the document they had discussed the previous evening. "It's all in order," Harrington confirmed as Blake reviewed the papers. "Legal notification of marriage, with copies to be delivered to the St. Louis courthouse and to Howard Crawford personally." "And the restraining order?" Lillian asked, her voice betraying her anxiety despite the morning's success. "Included," Harrington assured her. "Based on the documented threats and property damage, Judge Wilson has granted a territorial restraining order prohibiting Crawford from approaching within 100 yards of either of you or your property." Blake signed the notification, followed by Lillian, who used Lillian Daniels for the first time, her hand steady as she formed the new signature. The moment carried weight beyond the legal implications, representing a true severance from her past and the establishment of a new identity. "I'll have these delivered immediately," Harrington promised, collecting the signed documents. "Crawford will receive his copy before sundown." Their final stop in town was the general store, where Blake purchased ammunition and additional supplies while Lillian selected fabric for curtains in their bedroom, a small domestic detail that somehow underscored the permanence of their union more effectively than the legal documents they had just signed. As they loaded their purchases onto their horses, Blake noticed Martin Wells observing them from across the street. Unlike their previous encounters, Wells made no move to approach, simply watching with an expression of calculated assessment before turning away. "They know," Lillian murmured, following Blake's gaze. "Word has reached them already." Blake nodded, helping her mount before swinging into his own saddle. "Good. Let's see how Crawford responds to the news." The answer came sooner than either expected. They had barely reached the halfway point on their journey home when Blake spotted riders approaching from the direction of their ranch, 5 men moving at a deliberate pace, led by the unmistakable figure of Howard Crawford. "Here we go," Blake said quietly, reining in his horse. "Remember the plan." Lillian nodded, straightening in her saddle as Crawford and his men drew closer. Blake positioned his horse slightly ahead of hers, his posture relaxed but his hand near his holstered revolver. Crawford halted his group when they were perhaps 20 yards apart, studying Blake and Lillian with cold fury barely contained beneath a veneer of civilized behavior. "Mrs. Crawford," he greeted, deliberately using the name Lillian had legally abandoned. "I was just visiting your accommodations." "Quite rustic. I can't imagine what appeal it holds for a woman of your upbringing." "Mrs. Daniels," Lillian corrected firmly. "As I believe you've been informed." Crawford's smile tightened. "A hasty ceremony doesn't change the facts of our situation, Lillian. This arrangement can be easily annulled once we return to St. Louis." "There will be no return to St. Louis," Blake stated flatly. "And no annulment. Our marriage is legal and binding, witnessed by Judge Wilson himself. Even Missouri courts will recognize its validity." Crawford turned his attention to Blake, studying him with the calculated assessment of a man accustomed to identifying and exploiting weaknesses. "You've overplayed your hand, Daniels. Whatever scheme you've concocted to secure my wife's fortune won't succeed." "Fortune?" Blake repeated, genuine confusion crossing his features. Lillian laughed, the sound startling in the tense atmosphere. Is that what this is about, Howard? You think I have money? She shook her head, amazement replacing her earlier anxiety. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back. Everything I have now, I've earned alongside my husband. Crawford's expression revealed his disbelief. Your father's estate was entirely under your control the moment we married, Lillian finished for him, as you reminded me countless times. Whatever remained after his debts were settled became your property, not mine. That's why you were so careful to ensure I had no access to funds of my own. The revelation seemed to genuinely surprise Crawford, suggesting he had attributed motives to Blake that had never existed. The miscalculation revealed something important about Crawford's character and inability to conceive of actions not driven by financial gain or power. Even if what you say is true, Crawford recovered smoothly, your place is in St. Louis, maintaining the household and social position appropriate to my wife. Former wife, Blake corrected again. And as of this morning, my wife. A fact you'll need to accept, Crawford. Crawford's facade of civility finally cracked, naked fury replacing his calculated demeanor. You've stolen what belongs to me, Daniels. I don't accept theft lightly, regardless of how it's dressed up in legal paperwork. People aren't property, Blake replied, echoing his earlier statement. Lillian has made her choice. The law recognizes that choice. It's time for you to return to St. Louis and build a life that doesn't include her. Or what? Crawford challenged, his hand moving toward the inside of his coat where a weapon likely waited. Or face the consequences of violating a territorial restraining order, Blake answered calmly. Sheriff Tanner is quite diligent about enforcing Judge Wilson's rulings. Crawford hesitated, clearly weighing his options. The mention of the restraining order information he shouldn't yet have received had caught him off guard. This isn't over, he stated finally, his voice cold with promise rather than heat. You've won a skirmish, Daniels, not the war. There is no war, Lillian interjected, her voice stronger than Blake had ever heard it. Only your refusal to accept what's been legally established. I am no longer your wife. I am no longer your property. I am Lillian Daniels now, and this is my home. The declaration, simple but powerful, hung in the air between them. Crawford's expression cycled through rage, calculation, and finally a cold acceptance that this confrontation would not end as he had planned. We'll see, he said finally, turning his horse with precise movements. We'll see how long this idyllic arrangement lasts when reality intrudes. With that cryptic statement, he signaled his men to follow, and the group rode past Blake and Lillian toward Elko, maintaining distance as required by the restraining order Blake had mentioned. Only when they were well out of sight did Lillian release the breath she'd been holding. Do you think he's giving up? Blake considered the question seriously. No, but he's reconsidering his approach. The direct tactics haven't worked. He'll try something else now. They continued toward the ranch, both alert for signs of damage Crawford might have caused during his visit to their property. To their relief, nothing appeared disturbed perhaps because Crawford had expected to find Lillian alone and malleable, rather than absent and newly married. That evening, as they shared a simple meal in the cabin that was now truly their home, Blake found himself studying Lillian's face in the lamplight. The woman who had arrived at his ranch starving and desperate had transformed into someone strong and determined, a partner in every sense of the word. "What are you thinking?" she asked, catching his gaze. "That Crawford underestimated you," Blake replied honestly. "He still sees the young woman he married 6 years ago, not the person you've become." Lillian considered this, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I was thinking something similar about you. Howard measures everyone by wealth and influence. He can't comprehend what you offer that he doesn't. A leaky roof and endless chores, Blake suggested dryly. Lillian laughed, the sound filling the small kitchen with warmth. Freedom, partnership. She reached across the table to take his hand. Love without conditions or expectations of obedience. The simple truth of her words settled between them, cementing something that had been building since those first difficult days of her recovery. They were bound now not just by legal documents or shared property, but by a deeper understanding that had developed through months of working side by side. That night, as husband and wife in truth as well as law, they found in each other the comfort and connection that both had believed might never be theirs to claim. Their union, begun as an act of rescue and sustenance, had evolved into something neither had dared hope for, a love born of mutual respect and shared purpose. As autumn deepened around them, they rebuilt what Crawford's tactics had damaged, replanting where fire had scorched the earth, repairing fences, and strengthening their defenses against whatever new approach he might attempt. Each day brought them further from the shadow of St. Louis and deeper into the life they were creating together. Word reached them through Jenkins that Crawford had indeed returned east, though not before making inquiries about property adjoining their ranch, a concerning development that suggested he hadn't abandoned his interest in Nevada despite his apparent departure. "He's playing a longer game now," Lillian observed when Blake shared this information. "Howard is patient when forced to be. He'll wait until we lower our guard." Blake nodded, trusting her assessment of the man she'd known far longer than he had. "Then we remain vigilant. And we continue building what's ours." What was theirs expanded as winter approached. Blake added a proper kitchen to the cabin, using skills honed during the war to create a space where Lillian could work comfortably during the cold months ahead. Lillian, in turn, established connections with neighboring ranchers' wives, gradually integrating herself into the community that had initially viewed her with curiosity and caution. Their first Christmas as husband and wife was celebrated with simple joy, a small tree cut from their own land, decorated with paper ornaments Lillian crafted during the long evenings, and modest gifts that represented thought rather than expense. Blake presented Lillian with a handcrafted writing desk, recognizing her love of books and language. Lillian gave Blake a quilt she had secretly pieced together from scraps of fabric, each square representing some aspect of their shared life. Winter passed without word or sign of Crawford, allowing them to hope cautiously that perhaps he had truly accepted the finality of Lillian's decision. Spring arrived with the promise of new beginnings, the land awakening from dormancy, just as their lives continued to unfold in ways neither had anticipated. It was in late March, as they worked together to prepare the expanded garden for planting, that Lillian shared news that would reshape their future once again. "Blake," she said, pausing in her work to meet his gaze, "I need to tell you something important." He straightened, noting the mixture of nervousness and joy in her expression. "What is it?" "I'm going to have a baby," Lillian said simply, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "In autumn, the doctor thinks." Blake stood motionless for a moment, absorbing the information with the careful consideration he brought to all significant developments. Then a slow smile spread across his features, transforming his usually serious countenance. "A baby," he repeated, setting down his tools and crossing to her side. "Our baby." Lillian nodded, tears of happiness welling in her eyes as Blake placed his hand gently over hers. "Our baby. A new life, completely free from Howard's shadow." The promise inherent in those words that their child would know only the love and partnership they had built together. Never the fear and control that had characterized Lillian's first marriage, cemented their determination to protect what they had created. News of the pregnancy spread through the small community with the inevitable speed of frontier gossip, bringing congratulations from neighbors and townsfolk alike. Even Jenkins unbent enough to offer Blake a cigar when he next visited Elko, gruffly muttering about the ranch finally getting a proper heir. Their happiness, though genuine, remained tempered by awareness that Crawford might still pose a threat. Blake took additional precautions as Lillian's pregnancy progressed, reluctant to leave her alone for long periods, and coordinating with neighbors to ensure someone checked on the ranch when his business required him to be away. Summer arrived with blazing heat and the promise of good harvests. Lillian's condition became visible, her body changing to accommodate the new life growing within. Blake found himself watching her with a mixture of pride and protective concern, marveling at the strength with which she continued her daily tasks despite the physical challenges of pregnancy. It was in July, as they celebrated their first anniversary with a small gathering of neighbors and friends, that word reached them of developments in St. Louis. Jenkins, reliable source of information that he was, pulled Blake aside during the festivities to share what he'd learned from a traveling salesman recently arrived from the East. Crawford's remarried, the shopkeeper informed him quietly. Some senator's daughter, half his age. Big society wedding, according to the papers. Blake absorbed this information with cautious optimism. When, last month, salesman had the newspaper clipping, thought you might want to know. The news suggested Crawford had finally moved on, his wounded pride soothed by a socially advantageous match that likely provided the status and connections he valued. Blake shared the information with Lillian that evening after their guests had departed. "You think it means he's truly given up?" she asked, her hand resting on her rounded abdomen where their child occasionally made its presence known with decisive movements. "Possibly," Blake allowed. "A new wife from a powerful family would make pursuing you more complicated, might damage his standing in St. Louis society." Lillian nodded, considering this. Howard values appearances above all else. If this new marriage provides the status he craves, perhaps he'll finally leave us in peace. The hope proved well-founded as months passed without incident. Their vigilance gradually relaxed, though never entirely. Blake had survived the war by maintaining awareness of potential threats, a habit that served him well as a rancher in isolated territory. Autumn arrived with golden light and cooling temperatures, the land preparing for winter's rest as Lillian's body prepared for childbirth. They had established a plan. The local midwife would stay at the ranch during Lillian's final weeks, ensuring experienced help would be available regardless of weather conditions. On a clear October morning, with frost etching delicate patterns on the windows of their expanded cabin, Lillian's labor began. Blake remained by her side throughout the ordeal, his steady presence a counterpoint to the midwife's practical efficiency. After hours of effort that tested Lillian's considerable strength, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to announce his determination to thrive in the challenging environment of his birth. "Benjamin," Lillian whispered as she held their child for the first time, the name they had chosen if they had a boy. "Benjamin Daniels." Blake studied his son's tiny features with wonder, recognizing in them echoes of Lillian's fine bone structure combined with something that might one day resemble his own more rugged countenance. "Strong name for a strong boy," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion he didn't attempt to disguise. "Born on his own land." The significance of those words, that their son had entered life not as a visitor or temporary resident, but as the rightful inheritor of the ranch they had built together, represented everything Blake and Lillian had fought to establish. Benjamin Daniels would grow up knowing only freedom and possibility, his future unshackled from the shadows that had followed his parents. Winter settled over the land, bringing with it the peaceful isolation that Blake had once cherished for its solitude. Now, the snow-muffled quiet of the season provided space for their small family to bond, establishing routines that accommodated Benjamin's needs alongside the essential work of maintaining the ranch. Lillian recovered her strength quickly, her natural resilience enhanced by happiness and purpose. By Christmas, she was fully engaged in ranch life again, balancing motherhood with her other responsibilities while Blake expanded their operations, planning improvements that would secure their future for years to come. Spring brought renewal to the land and new developments in their lives. Blake purchased additional acreage adjoining their eastern boundary, expanding their grazing capacity and securing water rights that would prove valuable in dry years. Lillian established a small schoolroom in their home, determined that Benjamin would receive education alongside the practical skills of ranch life. As their son grew from infant to toddler, his personality emerging with each passing month, both Blake and Lillian recognized in him the best qualities they had hoped to nurture: curiosity, determination, and an innate kindness that showed in his interactions with animals and visitors alike. It was during Benjamin's third summer that final resolution came regarding Howard Crawford. A letter arrived from Harrington, containing news the attorney felt they should know. Crawford died, Blake told Lillian after reading the formal communication. Heart failure, according to reports from St. Louis. Lillian received the news with complicated emotions visible in her expression: not grief, exactly, but a solemn acknowledgement of the final severance of a connection that had shaped so much of her life. His wife, she asked, practical even in this moment. Expecting their first child, Blake replied, scanning the remainder of Harrington's letter. Crawford's estate passes primarily to the child, with provisions for his widow. Lillian nodded, absorbing this information before asking the question that truly mattered to her. And us? Does Harrington mention any implications for us? Nothing direct, Blake assured her. Crawford apparently made no provisions regarding you in his will. As far as legal matters are concerned, your divorce and subsequent marriage closed that chapter definitively. The confirmation that Howard Crawford had finally, irrevocably exited their lives brought a sense of closure that even their marriage and Benjamin's birth had not entirely provided. The shadow that had lingered at the edges of their happiness, never fully acknowledged but always present, dissipated like morning mist under the Nevada sun. That evening, as Benjamin slept peacefully in the bedroom they had added to accommodate their growing family, Blake and Lillian sat together on the porch of the home they had built, watching the sunset paint the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. "I never expected this," Lillian said softly, her hand finding Blake's in the gathering twilight. "When I fled St. Louis, I hoped only for survival, for freedom from fear. I never imagined finding everything." Blake squeezed her fingers gently, understanding exactly what she meant. The ranch that had once represented his retreat from the world had transformed into something far more meaningful: a place of connection and purpose, of family and future. "Found each other," he replied simply, the words containing all that needed to be said between them. As night fell across the land they had claimed together, stars appearing one by one in the vast Nevada sky, Blake Daniels reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From finding a starving woman collapsed on his property to building a life and family that exceeded any expectations, the path had been neither straight nor easy. Yet every step from those first days of nursing Lillian back to health, through the challenges of Crawford's interference, to the joy of Benjamin's birth, and the quiet contentment of their daily lives had led precisely where they were meant to be. Together, they had fed not just bodies weakened by deprivation, but souls hungry for connection and purpose. In the end, what had begun as an act of basic human decency, a cowboy unwilling to let a stranger die on his land, had blossomed into a love story written across the rugged landscape of the American West, as enduring as the mountains that watched over their hard-won happiness.